Thank you very much for inviting me here today to chair the session and really get to the heart of some of the future challenges facing our national parks. I'm tempted to say you're at a national park conference when suits are outnumbered by check shirts and technical walking clothing out there, which I like to see. And also there's quite a lot of badges. There's quite a lot of stuff from the individual national parks around the country. I don't know if any of you remember the classic, I think it's 1980s film, The Warriors, with all the gangs in New York coming out to have a bit of a scrap. I think we can have a bit of that here, frankly, with all your different branded gear. Come on, Lomond, bring it on, hey? I'm known for spreading discord and bad news, so I thought I'd just start right there. It's true, I have done a lot of work up here in the Yorkshire Dales. I've also been here for quite a lot of entertainment and fun, and had plenty of time on limestone pavements and country pubs up here as well. So it is a tremendous place, and I'm very, very pleased to come back here, and I'm sure you're all very happy to be having your biennial national conference here. The point of today, as I mentioned, is really to look forward, and to look forward in three main areas: wildlife and nature, getting more young people and more diverse audiences into our national parks, and the role that national parks can play in the overall health of the nation. And just on those things generally, I think some of you will think, well, we've heard those issues before, and of course you have, because many of them have been around for many, many years. I think what would be really nice to get out of the speeches and the debate we have that follows that is to get a feeling of some of the actual levers that might need to be pulled to deliver these things, be they financial, be they regulatory, be their powers. What is it you actually want to deliver those things, and what is it that might reasonably be expected in the next 5 to 10 years, be it out of the Glover Review or whatever kind of shape falls out of DEFRA and its decisions regarding support payments for our land, because that is clearly going to be one of the areas where there is potential for the national parks to really, really deliver. And I think one of the things I would like to see, it'd be nice to see in sort of 10 or 15 years, that as someone coming into a national park, there was more of a step change when you came into a national park. It didn't just require a very impressive sign crossed with public art with a bit of beautifully sculptured stonework, which is great. I mean, those are great. But there's a feeling of, would I actually know I'm in the park? Or is it just, as I think some of us have noticed over the last 70 years, it is in some ways better than the surrounding countryside, but you have to kind of make a real effort to find that out. Do they need to be distinctively better? Really just the jewel in the crown, or the many jewels in the crown, I should say, not just something that's a slightly more precious metal than the rest of the country. I think that kind of step change would be a real something to aim for. Righto, well, we have, as I say, three issues, three areas, and to talk about those, we have three speakers. And first of all, I must welcome to the stage someone who is very much the godfather of environment and environmental campaigning in Tony Juniper. Now they've allowed him in the tent, and he is chairman of Natural England. So please welcome Tony Juniper.
Thank you very much, Tom. What a very nice tent it is. Lovely to see you all. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today at this very wonderful gathering of leaders from the national parks across the country, and also actually to be back in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, where I've not been for some time, but I used to be brought as a student to look at tarns and limestone pavements and various other things. And it's wonderful that it's all still there. So this is a very important year, obviously, for those of us in the official conservation world, or any aspect of the conservation world, of course, because this marks the 70th anniversary of the foundings of the different organisations and designations that have led us to where we are today. And actually 1949, awful long time ago, a very different world. But actually the really striking thing about that Act of Parliament that really touches me is the extent to which the pieces were being designed and talked about in 1942, in the depths of the Second World War. People were beginning to think about the post-war period and how the country could be made better and how people could benefit from different things that the state might do. And the idea of national parks, the idea of national nature reserves, the idea of bodies that would run those designations were being put in place even before the turning of the tide of the war. This was still a moment when actually it could have gone either way. And it's just quite inspiring to remember that people, leaders, real leaders, were thinking about that stuff at a time of real national crisis that makes our current crisis look rather modest in some ways. And yet there was space for nature on the agenda. People did manage to make the case. And I wonder if in the period of kind of national identity crisis, if that's what it is at the moment, whether there could be space for a new thought about the future of nature as it's delivered by government and the state, and whether we should now be thinking quite big given the context of where we are right now. One bit of the context that we're in today, and which reflects what happened back in those days, because despite the vision, actually we might have one or two reasons to question the wisdom that lay behind what subsequently occurred. Because back in 1949, we had what some people now see as this historic schism in conservation, with on the one side the championing of landscapes through one route being laid out, whilst on the other the championing of conservation and the protection of animals and plants being promoted through a different route. And so on the one side we had the idea of the agenda being about beauty and access, and on the other side it was about science and ecology. And just look at some of the designations we work with today, and you can see it right there. Area of outstanding natural beauty, site of special scientific interest. They're both conservation designations, but actually they're being done for reasons that sometimes don't necessarily join up. And so one wonders whether we might be thinking in this current moment of our history about the future, whether we might want to be reflecting on some of the big ideas that possibly weren't cemented as well as they might have been at the beginning of all of this. And as we're thinking about that future and how we might heal some of that schism, let's just reflect on some of the things that have changed since 1949. And these are some of the big environmental issues that are affecting the whole world. Well, for one thing, the population's gone up. So in the 1949 period, when the Act of Parliament was being put through Parliament, the population of the United Kingdom was about 50 million people. Today it's more like 66. So we've added twice the size of London. Twice the size of modern London has been added. And if you look at the population projections for the coming decades, we can expect an awful lot more to be added yet. And so that obviously is just creating more pressure across the entire set of environmental issues just because there are more people. And of course, on top of that, you have the multiplier of economic growth. As we've gone along, we've enjoyed rising living standards that's been achieved through expansion of the economy, which generally meant more stuff that's needed to fuel that economy in terms of resources and energy. And of course, on top of that, we need more food for more people. And one of the big changes that took place in that post-war period was the intensification and industrialization of agriculture. And for good reason. In that post-war period, the country had nearly been starved into defeat by a submarine blockade. Never again would that happen. We were going to feed ourselves from our own land. And so we threw the kitchen sink at agriculture, and with every good justification for doing that under the circumstances at the time. And not only has that caused big impacts on the landscape, of course it's been one of the principal drivers behind the decline of biological diversity, the loss of our wildlife in this country over recent decades. And the statistics are there for everybody to see. A new set of statistics will come quite soon in the revised data in the State of Nature report, and that will reveal the continuing loss of diversity, some generalist animals and plants continuing to increase. But I'd speak for most of us to point out that we probably don't want a countryside dominated only by dandelions and wood pigeons. Some things are doing well, other things not doing so well. So these big changes being driven by agriculture. Of course, on top of that, we have the fragmentation and pressures on the environment coming from development. So two big strands of that are visible at the moment. One is infrastructure, HS2, big piece of news coverage around that at the moment. And of course, all of the housing targets and the tens of thousands of houses that are being pledged to be built here or there, and the politicians vying with each other to come up with a bigger number. All of that, of course, is then exerting further pressure. And again, it's not as if this is an illusory problem. It's a real problem. We do have a housing issue in this country, and so the politicians are trying to find ways of responding to that, as well as upgrading infrastructure that in many cases is Victorian. So these are some of the pressures that are there. There's more of us. There's the impacts of agriculture and the continuing impacts of development. And then there's something new, which back in 1949, no one would have mentioned, of course, which is the effects of climate change. Beyond the impacts that we can see in individual bits of countryside and around the edges of cities, there is a system-level change taking place, which again is beginning to recast the whole environmental discussion. And you don't need to look very long in the news to realise how rapidly the change is going. We've had the highest ever temperatures recorded in this country this year, not only in the summer, in the spring, well, actually not in the spring, in the winter. For the first time we had temperatures going above 20 degrees centigrade, never before recorded. But this has been the rapidly shifting environmental change that is now driving the agenda, and which now really needs to be reflected in how we start to think about the next 70 years. So 70 years ago, we took this kind of bifurcation in the agenda into legislation and policy. Over that period, we've achieved a lot, but now we've got rising pressures, and now I think we need to be thinking about the future in a slightly different way. And so how should we think about the future, and what should we be trying to get from our national parks in dealing with some of that history? Well, one thing that we know we should be getting out of the national parks is public health and well-being. And I'm sure William will talk much more about this in a moment. But I think it's fair to say that we could be doing a lot more to get benefits for the public from these wonderful treasures than we have done. And actually what's really striking, Marion Spain, our chief executive at Natural England, the other day, she reminded us all of a quote from Town and Country Planning Minister Lewis Simpkins, who was in the Houses of Parliament in 1949 as that Act of Parliament was going through. And basically, I'm paraphrasing, he said, actually I won't paraphrase, I wrote it down. He said, "The enjoyment of our leisure with the open air and the ability to leave our towns and walk on moors and dales are just as much a part of positive health and well-being as the building of hospitals is insurance against sickness." 1949. Goodness me. Do we need that to be restated in the Houses of Parliament and re-owned as a political priority? Well, of course we do. And actually, one of the reasons why I'm so keen that we do more as a conservation community, whether that's through the national parks or anything else, as a conservation community in this country, to be promoting the health benefits of enjoyment of the open air assets that we have, is not only for the benefits we get for people, which are real and huge, and one figure that we use at Natural England is to point out an estimate that says that for every £1 we invest in helping people enjoy the natural environment, we save £7 in the National Health Service. That's really important economics that needs to be understood and owned and reflected in how we invest in the natural environment in this country. There's another bit of this which actually is equally important, and that is the extent to which we are not going to be able to solve any of these big environmental challenges unless we have public support. And that public support needs to be informed. And the way people are informed most powerfully about the natural world is by going out and to be in it. I don't know how many people in here are passionate about the environment and never go in it. Probably not many. But we have become, in the UK lately, I think we've become TV conservationists. Blue planet this, planet Earth the other, our planet, all wonderful and absolutely fantastic. But until you go and stand in the rain and hear a buzzard on a mountain, you don't really know about it. And so this, I think, is a dual strategy. The harnessing of these assets for public health, because that's good for the country, but also is going to be good for nature, because in the end it will be the way in which we build the support for what we need to do. And we know we need to go much further. We need much more ambition. And why do we need more ambition? Well, I mentioned it already, the decline of the health of nature is there alongside the health indicators for people that should cause us some concern. And actually, you know, these places of tranquility and beauty, the national parks, I think they've become too tranquil. You would walk in some of the wooded valleys in some of these hills 30 years ago and you would have heard a lot more birds and insects than you hear today. Songs and buzzing is becoming silenced as a result of a whole range of environmental changes taking place. Some of them I've mentioned linked with agricultural practices, some of them linked with climate change, the pollution of the environment, the changing of river quality. All of these things are contributing to that decline, and it's something that needs to be not only halted but reversed. And whilst the national parks, you know, do remain beautiful to many eyes, including to my eyes, it's important to remember that there's now a lot of stuff missing from those landscapes. The cultural dimensions are still there. We can still see the dry stone walls. We can see some of the archaeological treasures that we need to protect. But in many cases, the wildlife is very seriously depleted. I saw one piece of work yesterday suggesting that the SSSI condition, sites of special scientific interest inside the national parks, is actually lower than outside. And considering this is one of our premier conservation designations in the country, that should cause us to pause, I would say, and to think about how we can do better into the future. So there's an alignment with the biodiversity agenda that needs to be put there alongside an alignment with the health agenda. And then there's also that big thing I mentioned a second ago, the climate change agenda. Could the national parks and what they do be more aligned with that subject? Well, yes, I think they could be, and actually they're going to have to be, because earlier this year the British government was the first in the world to adopt a net zero carbon policy. So the zero carbon bit, I think we can all get that. We see the wind turbines on the hills. We're increasingly nearly run over by silent electric vehicles in cities. But the thing that maybe is still to be fully appreciated is the bit which is the net bit. And the net bit is the carbon that goes into the environment rather than the carbon that's coming out. And that bit of the carbon equation is really about nature. And as far as the national parks are concerned, two big ecosystem assets which we have, namely forests and woodlands and peatlands and bogs. These are places that hold enormous amounts of carbon, and as long as that carbon is in the ground, it's not in the atmosphere. And if we can do more to not only stop that carbon leaking, but to begin sucking it back in again, this is going to be a big contribution to net zero. So in the English peatlands, there is about 500 million tonnes of carbon, many years' worth of emissions from industry and housing. And if we keep it there, this is going to be a great contribution to meeting our climate change goals. And actually one figure that sticks in my mind, just to give an indication of the scale of this is a few years ago and was in a piece of writing I did, but the estimate at that moment was that the carbon being released from British peatlands, so the UK, not England, British peatlands was equivalent to all of the emissions of Cardiff, Edinburgh and Leeds combined. That's a lot of carbon. You think about decarbonising those cities, that's something we could do by halting and then reversing the loss of these ecosystems and their degradation. And then of course, we know increasingly, and actually there are tools now for us to harness this opportunity. We know increasingly that we can put an awful lot of carbon into agricultural soils as well, including those being grazed by animals. And this is where potentially we have some very good synergies between livestock agriculture, which often is in the national parks more than arable agriculture, and how we can be harnessing those industries and businesses to be part of the carbon solution too. So there's a lot to be said about that. And it's not only about how we reduce the emissions and begin to suck carbon into the ground and into ecosystems, it's also about how we adapt to climate change. And the national parks, again, have a very important role because downstream of quite a few of our national parks are quite a few cities. And during recent years, some of those cities have suffered from really quite high impact flooding. And some of that flooding has been linked with land use in the uplands nearby. And as the weather becomes more extreme, and it is doing, we can all see that and the records tell us that, then perhaps it's going to be possible for us to do more to hold water in the uplands for longer, thereby smoothing out these flood peaks and making them gentler. And you can see data that shows how we can do that by putting more vegetation in the hills, by recovering the health of the blanket bogs, and by restoring forests in key areas, especially natural forests rather than plantation ones, in ways that hold the water back in the hills and help to reduce those flood peaks that hit the towns and cities. So there's quite a lot crowding into this new space for the next 70 years, as I would describe it. We need to do more for health. We've got to get more benefit there. We need to get the wildlife back. We need to be catching carbon. We need to be the land being used to reduce some of the effects of these extreme weather conditions. Well, can we do that in the national parks? Well, the answer is yes, we can, and we can do it in ways that are going to work with the local economy, in ways which are going to bring benefits to the people who live in those places. And one example I saw recently, I was taken by some colleagues at Natural England to Ennerdale in the Western Lakes. Anybody been over there? Probably people from the Lake District will know this part of the world. Basically over there is a rewilding experiment is getting underway. And so this is involving a partnership of actors, including the local farming community, very closely involved, alongside United Utilities, the big water company in the northwest of England, the Forest England organisation, which runs the Forestry Commission's land estates, and Natural England as well, alongside various other organisations, to see what can be done to put nature back into that valley. And essentially what's been done, as is what is being done in other rewilding experiments, it's not a question of planting the place up, it's really just a question of withdrawing and seeing what happens. And what's happening there, for me, looked extremely positive. Walking along one of the rivers, there are a lot of birds. There's dippers, there's wood warblers singing. The insect population has gone back up. The place is carpeted with different kinds of wild plants. There's bits of woodland appearing on the hillside that weren't there before. And some of those bits of woodland are coming back where the cattle were allowed. Cattle haven't been allowed up there for some time. It had been mostly sheep, but by changing the grazing animals, those animals have been able to start shifting the ecosystem, and those animals proved to be very valuable as beef cattle. And so people started putting two and two together. United Utilities, they want the clean water coming down for public supply, and the Environment Agency, who are also involved, want to reduce flood peaks. Everybody's finding that they're getting something out of this particular experiment, and something which could lead to some really very exciting conclusions in the years to come. It struck me as one place where we might want to reintroduce beaver to England, an animal that would do even more to hold the moisture back in the landscape and to be purifying the water. So I think we can do this stuff, and we need to do it in a planned way and in a careful way. We don't want to be undermining values that we've championed in the national parks for decades. We don't want to be changing landscapes in ways that are going to be detrimental. We don't want to be making these places less tranquil. We don't want to be excluding people. And in fact, in Ennerdale, there were a lot of people there walking, looking at this amazing resurgence of nature. And there were more people there than in some other parts of the Lake Districts that I walked in that week. So I think these things can be pulled together. And one of the things that's very exciting at the moment is that we have a toolkit that looks like it might be able to help us. I think where we've got to at the moment in conservation, it's been based on an inadequate set of things that we've got to make it happen. The 1949 Act, it laid out some of the pieces, and we've been doing our best with them. But actually now the toolkit looks like it might be moving into a new place where we can go beyond what we've been doing, which is protecting and conserving the best places, to now beginning to restore and enhance not only the best places, but to improve the quality of those which have been heavily degraded. We have the 25-year environment plan. That's got this incredible world-leading idea of we're going to leave nature in a better state than we found it. Most of conservation that I've seen over the years has been about hanging on to the last bits. This is setting out a policy platform to actually start putting stuff back. That's different, and it's actually, excitingly different. We have a potential change as we depart from the European Union in being able to move beyond the common agricultural policy into this idea of public money for public goods, the environmental land management scheme. That could be hugely powerful in being able to join some of these dots. We have this idea of net gain. So that development that previously has been causing such environmental pressure, We could be harnessing resources out of development and putting it into conservation to be creating new funds and new revenue streams to be able to begin bending the curve back. We have government tree planting targets. Millions and millions of trees are going to be planted, and hopefully there'll be some natural regeneration. And then alongside all of those measures, we have this new net zero policy that I mentioned a moment ago, which, if it's going to succeed, has to be as much about the land as it is about energy and transport. And then, of course, wrapped into all of that, we have this growing awareness about the public health benefits and indeed the wider economic gains that we can get through the restoration of nature, whether that be in relation to water security or wider climate change resilience. So I think this is an exciting moment where we can look forward and think, actually, now is the time to do things in a radically different way, to start drawing all these things together. So that historic bifurcation of conservation, landscape and nature and science, we can now start drawing this together. And not only is it about landscape and nature, it's about people, it's about climate change, and it's about economic development. And the more we can join and integrate these pieces, then the better the outcomes will be, we would argue, at Natural England. Having said that there's been this historic schism, as it were, in conservation, it's just important to reflect that in 2006, when Natural England was formed, this actually was a moment when these two things were put back together again. The Countryside Agency and English Nature, amongst others, were put into one institution. And I think what happened as a result of the period of cuts and squeezing of our budgets that subsequently occurred is that actually we at Natural England have not been as high profile on the access side as we have, or landscape side, as we have on the nature conservation side. But certainly myself and Marion, our chief executive, and the senior team at Natural England, we take the view that we do need to be bringing this much more integrated approach to the fore. Because if we sit in our box and the access and landscape people sit in their box, and the climate change people sit in their box, and the water people sit in their box, and the forestry people sit in their box, we're not going to get what we could get were we able to come together and to be able to design common integrated agendas. And so we're very much looking forward to working with all of you and sharing our technical expertise, designing common strategy, working together at area level. Our area teams, I think, are already working with most of the national parks in different ways. We want to up that. We're increasing the resources we're putting into this, and hopefully over the coming years, the narrative on conservation at that political level will begin to shift. Because at the moment, it looks like, conservation is an unaffordable cost, and therefore in public spending reviews we don't get what we need. If we can start painting that more integrated picture and put that to the people deciding where we're going to be spending public money into the future, hopefully we can start to get the investment to realise the kind of vision that I'm talking about. But even irrespective of that, I think we can make a good start today by putting landscapes, nature, people, carbon and all these things together. So our door is open. We're very much looking forward to working with everybody, healing that historic schism, hopefully coming forward with an integrated idea, and hopefully one that's going to inspire much more action into the future. Thank you very much.